You're listening to Sustainably Geeky, the podcast for everyday environmentalists.
Hi, you're listening to Sustainably Geeky, episode 67. Today, we're going to be talking about fire with Spencer Wilson, who is a resource advisor with the Forest Service. Spencer, thank you so much for joining us today. Can you start by just sharing a little bit about yourself and how you came to work in this field?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So as you said, my name's Spencer Wilson. Uh, I started out my work in the Forest Service as a wildland firefighter. I started out on what's called the Type 2 Initial Attack Hand Crew. So it's a module of 20 to, I think now the max size is 20 to 22 people that go out and work on wildland fires. And I did that for several years before transitioning to working on hotshot crew, which is more or less the same thing. It's just at a slightly elevated level, I guess, of work production and time commitment, but still a seasonal employment gig, but still works in the same 20 to 25 person crew sizes. And then I went from there and sort of pivoted into the role that I'm in now as a resource advisor. I also work as a fireline EMT when I don't get assigned to a fire as a resource advisor. The resource advising gig was something I switched into because it uses my my degree as in environmental science a little bit more specifically. It's also just generally a little less hard on my body, and it was nice to kind of move into a different realm in the fire world, but still, remain attached to it. So that was kind of my path to where I am now, and yeah, remains to be seen what the future holds for me.
Very cool. Well, I definitely want to talk about what you're doing now, but first, I think it's important for us to talk about why fire is important and I guess why we're having this discussion. First of all, people might hear fire and just think that's, a no-brainer. We don't like fire. Fire's bad. Fire destroys things, but I think there's more to it than that. So can you talk a little bit about the role that fire plays in nature and, specifically some of the good things it does, maybe in addition to some of the bad things or the myths that we've heard in the past?
Yeah, absolutely. So fire is a very natural part of the ecosystem in large portions of the globe, really, but specifically in North America. It's a huge factor of life, for all sorts of ecosystems in the North American um, landscape. In we talk about fire regimes, so different types of fuel models, which is the term we use for, I guess, ecosystems and the way that they're impacted by fire. Different types of fuel models have different fire regimes, and a fire regime is just sort of referencing the regularity with which you can expect a fire in that landscape. So things like prairies and grasslands, and even the shrub steppe that we have here in the Northwest, where I'm located, places like that, they expect to have fires. The plants, the plant life is sort of built around having fires, on a 5 to 10 year fire regime. So every 5 to 10 years, you can expect an area to burn. Whereas in more heavily forested areas, that fire regime can, be a little bit more consistent in the like 25 to 30 year range. And then there's areas of the country, the wetter areas, rainforest, coastal lands, where, a fire 50 to 100 years apart is kind of the norm. But all of those different ecosystems still require fire, even though the regularity with which they need it varies greatly. And fire serves a lot of different purposes in those ecosystems. So in the grasslands, in the areas where fire happens more consistently, or it's supposed to, as we would say, from a scientific standpoint, those areas, the fire serves to just sort of clear out all of the dead debris and all of the grass that's been around too long, and it basically serves as sort of a self-fertilizing function. It kills everything off. It doesn't burn at a super high intensity. Typically, grass fires happen very, very quickly, and they move through the landscape in a very short period of time, which as a result means that only the stuff on the very surface of the soil is going to die. And it really just turns into more of a carbon deposit that then gets used to regenerate the next, life cycle, basically. In a forested area, those same fires that happen, on more of a 20 to 25-year range, they serve kind of a similar purpose, but they are oftentimes a little slower moving. They burn a little bit hotter, but they also take care of a lot more of, like the woody debris that's dead and down and in between the trees. And it's a little bit more of kind of a pruning mechanism. It can also help clear out the underbrush, and it can reestablish new plant life. And sometimes those fires, they burn a little bit deeper down in the soil, so they take out a little bit more of the microbial life. But ultimately, that's a good thing because it allows for some of those deeper rooted plant species, those trees, the Douglas fir, the ponderosa pine. It allows for those things to essentially just not have as much competition for a while. And then, the kind of further reaching ramifications of that beyond just the plant life that's being directly impacted by the fires burning, the living organism itself, is then the animal life that comes back changes the landscape for them. So when all of the underbrush has been kind of removed, it makes it so that the bigger critters have an easier time moving through it. Your deer, your elk, your moose, things like that. And then the stuff that is regenerating on a smaller scale, like the small shrub life, right? That provides habitat for all kind of your little critters. So fire is a very much a feature of the Northwest ecosystems, and I mean the North American ecosystems at large. The regularity with which it's supposed to occur is definitely a variable that is impacted by human involvement, but it's something that a lot of different areas really need to have on a semi-consistent basis. The span of that consistency obviously is the biggest variable there. The other thing is there are certain types of plant species in North America and in other parts of the globe that require fire for their reproductive processes. Lodgepole pine is a good example of that. It grows very close together, and the fires help both spread the seeds. The large updrafts that come from fires can basically cast the seeding bodies of the lodgepole pine into the air and help them spread over great distances. But also they have pine cones that have a hard waxy substance on them that doesn't open until a fire of significant intensity comes through and actually melts that off of them and allows them to open and drop their seeds. And there's a couple other plants, I honestly can't recall all of them off the top of my head, but they have a similar function where until there's a fire of substantial heat, they don't actually reproduce. So, there's a number of different ways that fire is a positive feature in the landscape.
So even though it causes a lot of destruction up front, it makes room for more growth in the long run, and kind of, I guess, the cycle of life literally, isn't possible without some of that destruction is what it sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, destruction is sort of a tricky term to use there too, because in a lot of those natural fire regimes, the destruction, if you will, is very short lived because the fires are not burning in theory, under their ideal circumstances. They're not burning with this cataclysmic intensity. They're not killing off trees. They're not destroying the entire forest. You don't see, in natural areas that have a more natural fire regime still in place, you don't really see these like what we call nuked out areas. It looks like the after effects of an atomic bomb where everything is just ash and dead and burned, to absolutely nothing, which I think is kind of the classic media representation of the after effects of a wildfire. But part of that is because that's becoming more and more commonplace these days. Whereas in a natural fire regime that is, where fire is doing the things that it's supposed to in the landscape it's supposed to be in at the intervals that it's supposed to be there, and the really even the short term effects really don't look that bad. We get a lot of what we call understory burns, So in a forested area, the needle cast, the pine needle buildup on the ground gets burned. A lot of the dead woody debris gets burned, but within the span of maybe 2 to 3 months, there's already stuff growing back on the ground, even, and the trees aren't getting torched out, so they all look healthy. They don't look any different, after one of those fires rolls through. So like ideal intensity is a really big factor.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. I mean, like you said, under normal circumstances, if fire was allowed to kind of live out its normal life cycle without human interference, it would probably be a lot less severe in a lot of cases. But because humans have, in their infinite wisdom, intervened and tried to control everything, I think we're kind of seeing some of the worst, case scenarios, like you're saying, despite knowing, that there are a lot of benefits to fire. So, why has the historic attitude in the U.S. and probably other countries around the world been towards fire suppression over the years rather than letting these natural processes play out? Is it a lack of knowledge? Is it fear? Maybe it's a little bit of both or something else.
Yeah. So there's a lot of factors, right, that have all kind of compounded. Um, so for one, in the United States, which is most of where my awareness is based off of, just because that's where I grew up and went to school and also fought fire. Or I guess I should say North America, because I had done some time in Canada. But in North America, but specifically the U.S., the policy towards wildfire for right about 100 years was just full suppression. So anytime there was a fire, we went and tried to put it out. That sort of started kind of in I think it was 1910 was when there's this fire that's referenced. It's called the Big Burn. There's a book about it. Um, I believe that's where one of our tools, the Pulaski, it came from a guy, Ed Pulaski, who was involved in that fire. That one I'd have to be fact checked on, to be totally honest. But anyway, the Big Burn was this major catastrophic fire that happened in 1910, and there was a whole lot of very destructive fire that happened, and it burned an entire town. I cannot remember the name of it, and very, very many people died as a result of that. And so it was this huge destructive fire, and that sort of kicked off the movement, and the attitude towards wildland fire that was just that all fire is uncontrollable and therefore bad and needs to be stopped. And so for about 100 years, um, the policy was just anytime that there's a fire, a wildland fire, we have to go and put it out immediately. And so that had some pretty far-reaching ramifications, right? Because now all this deadened down fuel that I was talking about, the needle cast, the branches on the ground, the logs that have fallen from trees, all of that stuff that would normally get cleared out, on this anywhere from 10 to 30-year interval, is now not getting cleared out. So you're missing at least, at a bare minimum, you're missing almost 4 cycles of that, but at a maximum, almost 10 cycles of that clearing process. And that has just caused an enormous amount of what we call fuel loading, right? Which is just the available burnable material on the ground. So that's kind of problem number one, right? That's the first thing, the easiest one to point to as far as human impacts on the fire regime. The second biggest impact is that more and more people are wanting to have a cabin in the woods, and there's just more people in general. So as people start moving out of the cities and into these more rural areas, we call it the wildland urban interface. So it's where people are living in places where fires want to be. We have more values at risk. We have more people's houses and homes and pets and barns and, various things at risk in those areas. And then we have more opportunities for fires to happen. Power lines that can fall, people who are just messing around in the woods, somebody with a motorbike without a spark arrestor. I mean, any of those things, right? Those are all just chances for fires.
Gender reveal parties.
Yeah, gender reveal parties. Right, where you need 6,000 pounds of TNT and some colored smoke to let everybody know that you're having a bouncing baby boy, right? Like all of those things are opportunities for wildfires to happen and to get out of hand. And then, the third one I think that is gaining more and more traction in public awareness is just climate change, right? Is a huge factor. Summers are getting longer, they're getting hotter, the entire globe is getting warmer. Um, Also, what is happening there is, your wet and rainy and cold seasons are shorter. The wintertime is, it's abbreviated. And what we're seeing a lot more of is, we're still having we have a lot of intense storms that happen, it seems like now, but they're shorter lived. And the problem with that is in fire, we have kind of 4 uh, fuel types that we reference really consistently, and it's based off of how long it takes for those fuels to sort of equalize with the ambient moisture content of the air. So we call them 1 hour fuels, 10-hour fuels, 100-hour fuels, and 1,000-hour fuels. And each of those fuels, it's so a 1 hour fuel, if the relative humidity of the surrounding air is 45%, a 1 hour fuel after 1 hour at that percentage will have a 45% moisture content, right? And 1 hour fuels, is things like dried grass, pine needles, small, very fine fuel models. 10-hour fuels, right, takes 10 hours to adjust, and those are things like your sticks that are about the size of like your finger, or maybe a pencil, something about that size. And this is all for dead fuels. Live fuel moisture is a little bit different in how it reacts. And then 100-hour fuels is something like maybe around the size of your wrist, or a little bit bigger than that. And then 1,000-hour fuel, is about anything like the size of maybe your leg or your waist, depending on how large of a human you are. And so the issue is with these inconsistent storms, these shorter storm cycles, and these abbreviated winters. 1,000 hours. What is that? That's 40 something days, right? So you need 40 something days at an elevated moisture content or elevated humidity level to get your 1,000-hour fuels to get to their wintertime moisture levels. And then on the back end, it typically takes 1,000 hours for those to dry out. The problem is when you don't have enough time for those 1,000-hour fuels to reach their typical wetness over the span of a winter. Now, even if you have a year where you're not in a drought, your largest fuels, the biggest energy component, releasing culprits in a forest fire, they never reached that same level of wet that they normally would. So, which is all, it's kind of a lengthy explanation for why, for one of the bigger problems we have, but those big fuels that are responsible for a lot of the high heat, which translates into more destructive fires, they're even on a wetter year, they're not getting as wet as they normally would, which is a big reason why we're having this compounding fire season effect, where it just seems like every year they keep getting worse and worse and worse. And it's sort of because these fuels are just, kind of getting drier and drier over time, because now that we have a longer drying season and a shorter wetting season, they get a chance to get even, less and less damp each year. And so that's another kind of oddball one that I don't think most people are aware of, but it is definitely a pretty significant factor. And as far as a fire modeling standpoint is concerned, that's a huge issue.
So we've got more fuel because of years of fire suppression, and then we've got hotter conditions because of climate change and fluctuating seasons, and the inability, like you said, of these things to actually get dry enough that they won't burn, and compounded with all these other factors that happen in nature, and we're just basically set up for months-long wildfires. And it's just baffling to me when I hear about these fires. Sometimes I'm like, how much more could there be to burn? Like, literally, we're gonna run out of trees, right? Eventually there's not going to be any forests, and it's terrifying because we're talking about some of the oldest growth in the country, maybe the world in some of these instances. And it's so sad that we're losing these, not just losing life, but we're losing this historic part of our world and part of the ecosystem. And they play such a vital role that I don't even know where to start with all that, but I'm sure you've seen it
Yeah,
firsthand and it impacts you even more so.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's devastating, when you go through those areas that do have those massive fires. It's an interesting feeling because, it's just it feels so sad. You go through these completely nuked out areas, and it is kind of that feeling. It's like, how much more can there be left to burn, because you'll have these fires that are 50, 100,000 acres, and it's not 100,000 acres of just understory growth. I mean, understory burn, where it's clearing out all the brush and stuff. It'll be, 100,000 acres where it's killing 90% of the trees in that region, and like you drive through it, it's like, man, how could this ever get fixed? This just seems impossible. And sometimes it kind of feels overwhelming when you go through that stuff. Seeing the fires in action is, you know, for lack of a better word, awesome. In like in the true meaning of that word, I guess it's awe-inspiring and it's very humbling. Um, but then, yeah, as soon as the fire is passed and through, it changes from this, awe-inspiring thing to just sort of this general feeling of, you know, devastation, because it is, and it's just so much death. Honestly, seeing all of those trees and all those plants that are just kind of reduced to ash, and um, yeah, it makes you wonder at times. It's like, oh, is it ever going to stop? I don't know. Like, do we run out of trees one day? Maybe. I don't know. It's hard to
Yeah, not
say.
to mention all the animals that and humans, but to a larger extent that depend on these forests as their home and everything. But um, anyways, let's move on to maybe slightly less depressing things.
Yeah, maybe you're away from
So
this stuff.
obviously, the attitude in the U.S. has historically been one of suppression. All fire's bad. Has there been a shift in recent years, especially seeing maybe the error in our ways and the impact of this policy? And are we kind of veering to the other way, or what do you think is kind of the next steps for?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, in several different ways. So, from just a forest management standpoint, there has been a big push in the last several decades. I don't actually know when the official implementation of it began, but prescribed fire is now a very large part of forest management. And prescribed fire is exactly what it sounds like taking fire and reintroducing it into an area where it hasn't been for quite some time in a lot of cases. And, the Forest Service tries to do that in a very careful way. We'll prepare entire areas. They'll pick units out. They design a burn plan, and the local resources go through, and we actually build our fire lines in advance. We sort of do all the firefighting before the fire is there, and then it allows us to hopefully light the fires, in a more optimal weather window is kind of usually what we're basing that around. So when it's not as hot, not as dry, and when we can plan around wind events, we try and make it so when it's not windy is typically the practice. And then we'll set these fires and let the fire kind of clear out certain areas. And they usually have a prescribed tree mortality rate that they're looking for, and they have a level of consumption that they're after. And, all of that is sort of and all of that is just to try and mimic what fire would naturally be doing in that landscape. And that's been a big push in recent years. Another thing that the Forest Service and other firefighting entities try and do a little bit more of is when it can be allowed for doing more fire management rather than fire suppression. So, what that means is when you have a fire that's in an area that needs to burn and it's not moving in a particularly destructive fashion, sometimes, we'll let it grow bigger to try and cover more ground in a less destructive fashion. So that way we can allow fire to sort of be reintroduced naturally into a landscape. Typically, they try and do that more with natural caused fires. So it's more likely that you'll have a fire management uh, procedure or attitude on a fire that's caused by something like lightning than you would have if it was a downed power line or a chain dragging behind a trailer or something like that. Usually it's a more natural cause fire that they'll try and allow to just sort of do its thing. And we'll do what's called point protection when we're doing that, which is also a method of firefighting that we'll use when a fire is completely out of control. And point protection is just finding those values at risk that are in the path of the fire and making sure they don't get destroyed, but then allowing the fire to just burn on its own because we either aren't or can't stop it, as the case may be. Another thing that the Forest Service is pretty keen on is anytime there's fires in wilderness areas, which are just historically less developed, less logged, and less impacted by human, movements. For fires that are in wilderness areas are oftentimes just allowed to burn and burn out because they usually will. Most fires that happen in those areas just kind of burn themselves out because they'll run into areas where other fires had come through, or just places where there isn't enough fuel to support them, or it'll just the weather will change enough that the fire will just kind of go out on its own. So we do a lot of management of those fires rather than just immediate suppression, which sometimes to people who aren't as informed on that side of things, that can seem very counterintuitive. It's like, well, why aren't you guys out there putting it out right now? And it's like, well, because the fire is doing what we want it to, and it needs to be here. Because if we don't let this one burn the way that it's burning right now, then the next one, might destroy everything. And we would rather have to repaint the house than tear it down and build it again. So
yeah. Plus, you're having to probably think about like the dangers of sending a crew in to these situations where it's not, I guess you're picking your battles, right? Like, do I want to spend the time and manpower and risk their lives on this fire when?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And another thing that they do is when they have those prepped burn units and they haven't had a chance to light a fire in those areas, oftentimes if there's a wildland fire nearby, they'll just let it burn into it. It's like, great. We just got a free day of burning done by a fire that was already in the area. There's some budgetary stuff, that comes into all of that as well. As you can imagine, there's an incredible amount of red tape around putting fire on the ground when there isn't already fire present. The issue with all of that stuff, though, is that with these extended burn seasons, with these hot months that are going longer and longer on both ends, and these wet seasons that are ending so abruptly, and with our fuel moistures not reaching the levels that they typically would, the windows where you can put down prescribed fire are just getting smaller every year. There are years where you can't do it. There's just no point where it's safe to start a fire until the snow flies, and then once that happens, you can't start a fire because there's snow everywhere. And so that's turning into its own issue, right? Is like we're trying to re-implement all of this prescribed fire as fast and as much as we can, but for one, you're fighting almost 100 years of the exact opposite of that. And then for another thing is now that we're trying to correct it, we don't have as much time in the year where we can't. So, those are just their own issues, and it's a positive feedback loop, that we're trying to put an end to, and that's pretty tough. The other thing that we do in the Forest Service a lot of is we do pile burning. So you'll just go out with your crew, and this is what a lot of hand crews and engine crews do before the main fire season starts, is they go out and they cut down trees under a certain diameter, and they limb all of the ones that are larger than that, and they build piles out of everything they cut, and they wait for a couple of years, and they go back through in the wintertime and they burn that. And that's very effective. It has very minimal impacts on the forest health in terms of negative impacts. Obviously, there's a lot of positive things that can come from it. But those piles are great because they have lower carbon release components, which is a pretty useful thing. So it's less smoke overall, and it's just less greenhouse gases being emitted, by your fire suppression practices. It's also very effective for the longevity of forest areas. It helps the trees, become healthier, and it also kills less of the soil. So with broadcast burns, you can sometimes build more intensity than you want, and it can take that microbial life in the top couple inches of topsoil, generations, honestly, to totally recover. With pile burning, you will 100% kill the soil right underneath the pile. But, if you have a 10-foot by 10-foot circle on the ground that's burned up, that's a lot better than, 40 acres. So, yeah, those are kind of the main things that they're trying to do in terms of returning fire to the landscape. But, they're tough.
Yeah, it sounds like it, and especially with the challenges of the seasons shifting and the temperatures changing, it makes it even worse. I know you said you're mostly focused on North America, but I'm curious. Do you know of any other cultures, specifically? I'm thinking indigenous cultures that have a historic relationship with fire and an understanding of how it's needed in the landscapes, and maybe how they've managed those landscapes differently over time, and the results that they've had compared to what we've done the last 100 or so years.
Well, I mean, even in North America, there's quite an indigenous history around wildfire. That that's kind of one of the big talking points now, honestly, is with this reintroduction of fire into the landscape. There's been a lot of sort of, oh, no kidding, from people who are learning about how, all of these forests, when, white explorers, I use that term loosely because they weren't finding anything new, they were just finding things that other people already lived on. But those people found all of these beautiful, gorgeous forests that looked so pristine and amazing, and they're like, "Wow, it's wonderful what nature will do." And it's like, no, this was all very carefully taken care of for hundreds of years by the indigenous people that lived on this ground, and that was a huge thing. There's lots of history in several different regions in the U.S. of native cultures using fire to their benefit and to the forest's benefit. So in the Pacific Northwest, it was used a lot to just beat back underbrush, basically, and make areas easier for travel and easier for hunting, and also to reduce the intensity of fires that would come through uncontrolled. In the plains, it was used to to hunt. Actually, they would do that sometimes to move herds of buffalo around. They would also use it to clear out, and like refertilize ground for crops, basically. It's like all of that stuff was, prescribed fire, for lack of a better term. As far as in other countries, indigenous cultures using it right now, I'm honestly not aware of too many. I know that it's used in a lot of places for clearing ground for farmland, but that's sort of a little bit more of an industrial use rather than, preservation of a natural ecosystem.
Yeah, I think it's just important to note that, like you said, this has been done for years, generations, hundreds of years, and uh, now it's science is kind of quote unquote rediscovering these methods that have kind of been known this whole time. So it's nice that they're finally, I guess, listening, but also we could have avoided a lot of damage over the years if we'd have just, I mean, listened to the people who were taking care of the land in the first place. So,
Right,
um,
right. It's just another one of those cases too. I mean, it was outlawed. They made it illegal and
mm,
punishable, by various means if you were lighting prescribed fires, simply because that was what you know native people were doing, and they just wanted to stop it, basically. And so, like,
yeah,
that's a pretty interesting part of the history of the West, as it were.
yeah, yeah. We could do a whole show on that, I'm sure. We've talked a little bit about how climate change has impacted the amount and severity of wildfires. So I'm just wondering, in your time working in the field, um, just the short amount of time that you've been doing this work, eh, what are some changes that you've noticed in that time period since it has gotten so much worse so much quicker?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. So I started my first season was in 2013, um, and yeah, even since then. So when I started, I remember seeing we have we call it the saw shack. It's just where all the chainsaws are hung up and where you do all of your maintenance and such. And they had a poster, I guess, for lack of a better word, on the wall. Maybe you call it a chart. And it was just a catalog of all of the years that that crew had been in operation, and it listed the days on fire each season, and I think the number of fires they went to in that season. And this thing went back to, I think the earliest year on there was 1975 or 1970 or something like that in that location. But I remember looking through it, and up until the mid 90s, a big season was anything that totaled over, maybe 70 days on fire. Like there was hardly anything that crossed over the 60 threshold until about 95, maybe like 4 or 5 seasons. Nowadays, if you have under 100 days on fire in a fire season, you would consider yourself to have not had a very good season, because you wouldn't have made that much money because it'd be a low year. Nowadays, 100 days on fire is sort of expected, right? You have a 180-day season, give or take, and if you're not spending at least 100 of those days actively engaged on a fire, you would consider yourself to have a pretty quiet season. When I started my first season, I think I got everybody in the fire world, as far as the federal people are considered, they you sort of size up your fire season based off of the number of hours of overtime you work. So the reason for that is because the majority of your money comes from your overtime hours. Everybody who's a temporary employee in the Forest Service works what's called a 1039. They work 1,039 base pay hours. And the reason for that is because you're federally mandated to be covered um, with your various benefits if you're over 1,040 hours. So they hire you on for one shy of that so that they don't have to do any of that nonsense. And then send you out there at, I think the going rate for a starting firefighter now is right around the $13.80 an hour mark, something like that. So you make most of your money on overtime. So everybody always asks how many hours you got, and they're talking about your overtime hours for a season. So my first season, I think I made 450 or 500 hours, which on the type of crew I was on, that was a low season. But now that would be a very, very low season. By the standards then, it was like fair to midland. Nobody was like, wow, what a terrible year, but no one was writing home about it either. If you're on a hotshot crew now and you don't hit 1,000 hours in a fire season, um, you basically don't feel like you had a full season. You feel like you're kind of shorted as far as your pay is concerned. So yeah, even in that span of time, going to a point where 1,000 hours is the benchmark. Because even at that point in time, there were crews that would hit 1,000 hours, but that was kind of considered like, if you were on 1,000-hour crew, you were on a busy crew. That was going to be a lot of work that year. And a lot of crews that started in the Northwest, which has a later fire season, a lot of crews that started up in like the Montana area, it was pretty common that you wouldn't really hit that 1,000-hour mark. Hitting like 800, 900 for a hotshot crew, that was normal. But now, if you don't get 1,000 hours, you're like, wow, what a quiet year for us. It's just kind of the standard. And I mean, that's kind of crazy. 1,000 hours of overtime in 6 months of work. I mean, what that amounts to is, you're doing, so if you were working 40 hours a week for a full year with 2 weeks of vacation, that's 2,000 hours. So at 1,000 hours of overtime, you're working a full year's hours of work in 6 months.
Jeez.
My busiest season, I think I had almost 14. I was like 1330 or something like that. That's a lot of hours. That's a lot of work.
Yeah. And you would think that not to get too political, but the people who are so concerned about government spending would be looking at something like this and seeing it as an easy way to reduce it. If we can get less fires, less need for firefighters, we would save money. But I guess the correlation between that and climate change and everything doesn't quite make it that far.
Yeah.
We're looking at just a money standpoint, not to mention, the safety and health of people involved. But
Yes, absolutely. Well, and the other thing is if they did a better job, the far-reaching economic impacts of fire are far greater than just the wages you're paying the people to fight it, right? Like it's a massive sink, across the country in virtually every sector, right? Like the impacts. I mean, fire is a natural disaster. It's happening every year, and it's getting worse every single year, and it's predictable, unlike an earthquake. you know,
mhm.
they're gonna happen, and it's a problem. And spending more money on it up front would honestly save, you know, probably an untold percentage down the road. But it's tricky to kind of get people to buy in on that. And then the
Yeah,
other
but
issue. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say we're better at fixing problems after they happen than spending money up front to save money, down the road for some reason.
Right. And I mean, it's starting to get more and more press now because it's starting to affect more and more people than just the folks who are going out there to deal with it. Right. And, which is, I mean, it's ultimately a really good thing. But yeah, it's just sort of mind blowing that you can be out there, risking your life really, and working those kinds of hours for that length of time, year in and year out. And, your base pay wage is still under $15 an hour. Like,
Yeah, that blew my mind when you said that number. I was like, not even $14 an hour to literally put your life on the line. And I've actually heard that there are some parts of the country where they use prison labor to do that work and pay them, minuscule amounts of money to do these jobs, and I just can't. I can't
oh,
believe
yeah.
that.
Yeah, so I can look at it. I'm looking at it right now, actually. It looks like, okay, wait, that's 2022. One moment, I'm going to look up this year's. So a GS4 is kind of your basic level firefighter. If you're a GS4, that's sort of your entry level for most gigs. Um, and there was a bill introduced 2 years ago, I think was when that one came out, that raised the pay rate for all fire employees basically. And so it looks like now they're making a whopping 14.51 an hour as a GS4. My last year in the Forest Service, or my last year as a firefighter in the Forest Service, I get paid under a different pay scale now for what I'm doing. But my base wage was I think 13.31 an hour. My last year on a hot shocker.
God, that's just embarrassing for the money shows what we value some of these jobs at, and as a country we need to do better. But
Yeah, absolutely.
uh,
But yeah, it's crazy. I mean, that's nothing.
yeah. Well, let's talk about your new job, or your current job, I should say.
Mhm.
And I know you said you're a resource advisor, and that kind of entails that you work to minimize the impacts of firefighting on the landscape and natural resources. Can you talk a little bit more about what that means?
Yeah, so I like to tell people I'm a government-sponsored Lorax. I speak for the trees because the trees don't have voices. So a lot of what I do is when I'm on a fire, if you were to ask a firefighter, on the ground what I do, they would say I irritate them. And that's the majority of my job. So what I do is I go out, and it varies from fire to fire, just based off of the requirements of the fire suppression and the different values at risk and whose ground the fire itself is on, whether it's private or Forest Service or BLM or national park or what have you. But I will be assigned to a fire, and the group that I work under is usually run by a biologist who's considered the lead resource advisor. And they'll have a certain number of values within the fire perimeter or nearby that they want protected or not impacted. So maybe it's endangered fish in a stream, maybe it's a burial site of some sort, maybe it's some other archaeological artifact or region, maybe it's an endangered tree species or endangered cactus or something that's very uncommon and endemic to an area. And what they'll have me do is I go out on the fire line, and with the resources that are working there, uh, I interface with them, and basically it's my job to go, hey, maybe we don't pour all of our unused fuel into this stream if we can help it, or maybe when we're trying to put retardant down, if there's a ridge line, you know, 40 40 yards over, maybe we put it on that instead of dumping it directly into the creek bottom. Maybe if we're digging, when we're digging fire line in an area before we do a prescribed fire, can we dig some of the needle cast away from these trees that are endangered that we only have 14 of on this entire forest or something like that, right? So it honestly amounts to typically making more work for people, which makes me not particularly popular with the people doing that work. I'm what's referred to as an NPR, a non-producing resource. And the more NPRs you have in your area, the more work you're going to have to do, because they all really like to point their fingers and have crews go and do things. And so having been on both ends of that, dynamic, I can definitely understand people's uh, dissatisfaction with having me present. But ultimately, it's really important work, because it is those things that you don't really get a second chance at if they get destroyed, and that's kind of the whole point of the gig. And on other fires, it can be just making sure that when we're logging areas that have been burned, just to try to get some value out of the trees, I make sure that ownership lines don't get crossed, or if something gets harvested from an area it's not supposed to, that the proper person gets those resources, right? If we cut trees that are on somebody's property, we leave them in a place where they can access them instead of just taking them and loading them into our fire sale. Things like that. I'm also responsible for. When a fire is in progress, another thing that I do is just a lot of data logging. I'll go around and just sort of catalog everything that has been done as a fire suppression tactic, contingency lines that were made, dozer lines that were pushed, things that got, implemented but then not used, or implemented and then got burned over, what have you. I'll do a lot of cataloging and take photographs. Sometimes I'm even, partially involved in writing up our suppression restoration program. And that just means all the stuff that we're going to do once the fire is out to try and fix it all, right? Because when you push 40 feet wide of dozer line through a bunch of forest, you don't want to just leave a highway, right? You want to go back and try and replant some undergrowth, some brush, move things across it so people don't use it as a new 4x track, all that kind of stuff. So it's a pretty varied job, but most of it boils down to just trying to make things as much as they want to be, try and restore the ecosystem to the way that it's supposed to be before we got there, when possible.
Well, I'm glad to know that there is a focus on prevention and restoration, because I guess like many Americans, I probably just thought, oh well, you go in, you put the fire out, and you leave, and there's not much thought given to what gets damaged. But I guess there is a science to, what you can avoid doing, or how you can minimize where the fire goes or what gets affected, etc. So I'm glad to hear that we have programs like that, and people like you out there, tapping people on the shoulder, saying, hey, could you maybe give yourself more work and do it this way to save, the species of fish or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is, I mean, yeah, it's a fine line to walk because of that, right? Like, you can imagine the person who's been working for 13 days straight trying to do, this backbreaking labor for, you know, very few dollars per hour, and then they have some person who wanders up that they assume has never fought fire in their life, trying to tell them how to do their job, and it yeah, it can be a little bit of a dicey conversation at times if you don't approach it.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's a good thing you do have a background in that and can kind of speak the language and understand where they're coming from.
Yeah, I think so. And I try to draw kind of a balance in that because, like I said, I've been on both ends of the exchange, and I know how frustrating it can be when it seems like the person, like somebody rolls in, has absolutely no idea what you've been up to, hasn't been around, and suddenly wants to tell you how to do everything differently. It's like, dude, I'm on, hour 900 right now. I haven't seen my family in 5 months. I've missed 3 weddings this summer, and I am just exhausted. Like, you look like you just came out of the office today to like rub in the fire. Like, I don't want to hear it, and so I think just being cognizant of that is really important.
Yeah, I imagine that's a fine line to walk. Well, I guess it wouldn't be a discussion about fire if we didn't talk about fire safety. And with all of the increased risk factors we've talked about throughout the show, what are some things that you can tell people, especially if they're out in the woods or in nature, maybe camping, but even just general fire safety tips to maybe help prevent some of those big lasting fires and some of the silly reasons that they start.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of, on a personal level, if you're visiting the forests, right, and going camping and all that stuff, uh, our standard for if a fire is all the way out is if you can drag your hand through every square inch of it and not get burned, right? And so I would say try and hold yourself to that standard. If you have a campfire and you are leaving the area, you should be comfortable having your hand in every single area where that fire was burning before you leave. Otherwise, there's something in there that could ignite another fire, right? I've been on, I can't tell you how many fires that were escaped in unattended campfires, right? Like it happens all the time. And it's such an easy thing to mitigate. The other thing I would say is if you do live in that wildland urban interface, if you have a home that's surrounded by trees outside of the city limit, the best thing that you can do for yourself, but also for the firefighters, is have a defensible space. Make your house a place that, you know, is possible to keep the fire out of it. Because to be totally honest, we do what's called structure triage when we go through an area when there's a fire coming through. And if we come up on a place that has trees, growing right up against the house, limbs hanging over it, there's a bunch of, debris in the gutters, there's wood piles stacked against the home. We won't even, a lot of times we won't even bother because we don't have the time, and like your house, I'm sorry, nothing you own is worth my life. And if it's going to put me in harm's way to be around that and try to save, to spend 12 hours trying to make your house able to be saved, like I'm not going to bother. Your house is going to, what's going to happen is going to happen, and I'm not going to impact that. So, both for the safety of the firefighters and also for, being able to come back and have your home still standing, I think the best thing you can do is to put in that work ahead of time. Make sure you have a wide buffer between burnable material and your home. It, I suppose, doesn't make for the most beautiful cabin in the woods look when you have, 30 or 40 feet of clear space between your home and the next tree or the next shrub. But I mean, it sure beats coming back to an ash pit, you know? And so doing that sort of preventive maintenance, making sure your wood piles aren't stacked against the home, things like that. It'll ensure that, firefighters, if they can, will actually try and save your property. But it'll also keep them from being in harm's way, in the process, which I've known a couple of firefighters who have died doing that, trying to save property. Because typically that's what it is, right? I guess maybe I wouldn't say typically, but it's not uncommon for firefighters to end up in bad positions because they're trying to save something that's really important, either to them or to somebody else. Um, and not a lot of fires are laying their lives down for trees, but it's a little bit different if it's somebody you know's home or something of that nature.
Yeah, I didn't live in a cabin in the woods, but you're making me think back to my house and how I probably had some things going on that, even in the city would not be considered very fire safe, as far as things up against the house and trees growing
Yeah,
too close, etc. So
yeah,
something to think about.
totally. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, ultimately, like in most cities, you're probably fine because there's a lot of pavement, in between you and any sort of fire that would be coming through. But on the other hand, I've seen it. I've seen towns burn down, and yeah, it's crazy. I mean, fire when it has the right conditions is just an absolutely unbelievable force.
Yeah. I know we're kind of running short on time, but since we do have some listeners, I'm sure that love nature and camping, do you have any tips specifically for folks who might want to, go off and camp and maybe start fires or cook over a fire or something? To dos or not to dos?
Yeah, I would just say make sure that you're, really being careful and checking with the local guidelines, because that's ultimately going to be your best indicator of what is and isn't safe to do, just because fire is such a regional thing, different areas have different rules around it, and those are for very particular reasons, And so I think being really well informed on that sort of thing is probably the best thing that you can do. And then, like I said, just making sure that if you're going to say that your fire is out, you need to be able to put, your hand in every single area of that, burnable material. So those are probably the two biggest things. And yeah, respect those guidelines. It's sort of astounding to some of us, I think, at times when you see people in areas that are known to have very consistent fire regimes and are in droughts, and they're lighting off fireworks in the woods, for instance, or target shooting against areas that have rocks where they can have sparks, all of that stuff. It's all those little things, but man, sometimes it's like, we went to this fire, what are we, it's like, oh, do we know what the cause was? Oh yeah, someone was shooting off fireworks 4th of July in the middle of the woods. It's like, dude, come on, like, that's the
Or
hottest part of the, what are you doing?
flicking cigarettes out the door of their car when it's, been a drought for 100 days or something ridiculous. Like,
Yeah, totally,
things
totally.
people probably just think, oh, it's a tiny flame, but it can spread really fast. So,
Yeah,
um,
down in the Southwest, I was on a hotshot crew down there, and the first fire I ever went to was from a chain. We call them chain drag fires, and it's literally just the chains that hook your trailer to your car. Like safety chains you put on there. If they
mhm.
drag on the ground, they can cause sparks that will start fires, and it happens all the time. It's one of the more
Yeah,
common causes of fires down there. That's
yeah,
such a little thing and so easily mitigated, but people don't even
yeah.
think.
Well, if nothing else, listeners, I hope you all this conversation makes you all think more about, I guess, those actions and how little quick things can cause a big fire. And like I know I lived in Texas, and whenever I'd camp in the summer or even spring, sometimes you'd have to check, is there a burn ban? Because if there is, you can't cook over a campfire. And you, like you said, you just got to be prepared for those local rules and everything. So,
Yeah, absolutely. And just make sure you have water on hand if you are going to do that.
hmm.
Be
Oh
able to,
yeah,
be able to put it out.
yeah. Number one. Well, Spencer, do you have anything else that we haven't covered that you think is important to talk about before we move on?
I would just say if you find any opportunities to offer, voting support, or if you see anybody lobbying for signatures or trying to increase awareness around firefighting and the risks and impacts that it brings upon firefighters themselves, support it. It's a thing that's really needed, and they are having such a hard time right now keeping people in the firefighting business because the wages aren't there. The lifestyle is, I mean, honestly, miserable. People just don't want to do it. It used to be worth it because, 20 years ago, if you were making $15 an hour with 1,000 hours of overtime, that was pretty good living, but like it just doesn't cut it anymore. And you put that on top of being away from your family for 6 months out of the year, being in danger, sleeping on the ground, breathing smoke every single day, day in and day out, carrying, 30 to 60 pounds on your back every day. Like it doesn't make sense anymore. Nobody wants to do that. And that needs to change, because the fires are still going to be here, whether or not the people are out there to deal with them. And so, yeah, if you get any opportunity to vote in support of that, support it, with any sort of person who's looking for signatures, any of that kind of thing, I would say just please do, or please consider it. Because, I mean, last season alone, I was talking to somebody who was a hiring authority, and they were telling me it was like 75 or 80% of hotshot crews couldn't fill their rosters. That used to be a job that was in such high demand that you couldn't expect to get in your first season, So it's just like, it's very quickly turned into a pretty big problem, and not just because of the fires, right? We're running, like, people aren't wanting to fight them. So,
Yeah, and I mean, firefighting, I think, is something that crosses political lines. Any kind of disagreements. I mean, I think everybody can agree that fighting fires is important, and we need to put resources to that and value the people who are doing that hard and dangerous work. So, definitely agree.
Yeah.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about. Do you have any additional resources for folks who want to learn even more about this and kind of delve deeper into the world of wildfires?
I'd say, well, so most forests have pages that offer information about things like burn plans and burn guidelines. They'll let you know when prescribed fire is happening. They also have any of their hiring announcements and stuff, if that's an aspect of it that you're really interested into. I honestly, to be totally candid, I haven't encountered all that many media sources that I feel do a particularly good job of covering what firefighting is really like. Um, because it's a grungy world. It's very rough. It's very uncouth. It's not a pretty scene. But that's kind of the appeal of it, I think, to me. And that's a hard thing to dress up in a particularly palatable way for the general public. And as of yet, I don't think I've really found anything where I was like, okay, yeah, this actually nails it. I think they do a really good job of representing what fire is like. But I think in terms of just, basic information and such, I think, looking at your local forest webpage, and whatever your ranger district you're closest to, especially if there's a lot of smoke in the air or something, you can usually find the information on that. And most large fires have social media pages nowadays. So if you learn the name of a fire, you can actually go on Facebook, and you can typically find some information about that fire, which is kind of handy.
Okay, well, that's great information. I guess we'll go ahead and move on to our green life hack portion of the show, where we just share with listeners one thing they can do to live more sustainably and maybe reduce their own carbon footprint. So, Spencer, would you like to start us out?
Ooh, I'm going to have to think about that. Well, do you want something that specifically pertains to what we're talking about, or just in general?
Totally up to you. It could be something you've implemented in your own life, or that you want to start doing yourself, that you think is a good suggestion for others that might be easy to implement.
Something that I do a lot more of lately is I just walk more. Um, I'm sort of an active person in general, but yeah, when I can manage it, I like to bicycle commute or walk commute, because there's definitely a big issue with greenhouse gases in this day and age, and it also just has any number of untold benefits for my mental and physical health. They say walking is one of the best forms of exercise for it. It's what the human body evolved to do the best. So I spend a lot of time doing that.
No, that's a great one, and something that I think if you live in an area where that's available to you, we could all benefit from, because in the U.S. we're very car centric, and I'm living in Ireland now, and I walk everywhere, and I notice a big difference in my physical and mental health when I am able to do that. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think part of it for me is exactly like you said, it's very car centric in the U.S., but I also think about when I'm in other countries, walking 15, 20 minutes to go somewhere is pretty normal. And when I think about it, where I am here, I'm in Spokane, Washington. I can walk most places in 15 or 20 minutes. It just rarely crosses my mind to even do so, And so just start planning that little extra bit ahead for me makes a pretty big difference.
It is a strange mind shift, though. I noticed because I visited Texas for the holidays, and granted, the weather wasn't really conducive to it, but even if things were within walking distance, it is a whole other thing to think, oh, I've got to leave an extra half hour early because, and here I just do it. I build it into the day. But yeah, it's very strange how we quickly switch to the systems we're used to.
Right.
Well, my green life hack this month is sort of in keeping with the theme of heat and getting it a different way than fire. And so I'm going to hold up my hot water bottle that I have come to sleeping with every single night because it is very cold here and I am not a fan of the cold. So I boil some hot water in a kettle, pour it in this thing, and it keeps me warm all night long. And it's just a great way throughout the day if I'm cold and I don't want to run the heater or I don't want to, be wearing 50 layers to kind of keep a little warmth close to me and not have to, burn fossil fuels. So that's my green life hack, a hot water bottle. I think you see those much more maybe in the more northern climates, but when I discovered that moving here, it changed my life. So
yeah, absolutely. To tag onto that, another, I think, a good self-heating option that I encountered not too long ago is you can get battery-powered hand warmers.
Oh, okay.
They plug into a USB outlet, just like your phone or any other of your devices. And instead of having to have these like little weird chemical hand packets that don't work half the time and then end up, invariably on the ground in a puddle of water, you just have a little reusable battery-powered one that you take with you all day.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
Excellent stocking stuffer, even though we're a little bit past that season.
Yeah, for next year.
Yeah.
Well, Spencer, thanks again for being on. And for folks who might be interested in following you online, are you followable, findable, or is there a way that people can keep up with the work you're doing or your organization?
Yeah. Yep. I don't have a professional page of any sort because I'm not a particularly professional person, as I said, with the whole uncouth nature of Wild and Fire. But I am on Instagram. My Instagram handle is @spilson_everything. It's SPILSON_everything. And that's where you can find me.
Okay. Awesome. And you can find me personally on Instagram and Twitter @HetsGonnaBeMe, the show on all social media as well as YouTube and everywhere you find podcasts, and that's Sustainably Geeky. And if you don't already, please subscribe, like, share, etc., so that we can get the word out. And if you have ideas for suggestions or guests, send them our way. Thanks again, Spencer, for being on, and for everyone listening, have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Jennifer.